Right, mate. Right, third time lucky.
You've got this, mate.
Oh dear. Hello and welcome to another bout of unboxing. Today my sparring partner is a good friend of mine from uni, Jamie Clements. Jamie is the co-founder of Sesame, which is ClassPass for digital members clubs, as eloquently put by Jamie in a quick message before this. He is also the host of the Man Down podcast. This is a podcast he set up fairly recently, which is about male mental health and just questioning the kind of norms around masculinity and what it means to be a man in society, which I kind of want to delve a little bit more into today. And I think that was inspired, among a few other things, around one of his friends who took his own life. I think it was last year. So yeah, really looking forward to having a good chat with Jamie, someone that I see him from time to time, but we don't, get a chance to go into a little bit more depth, over a pint in the pub. So Jamie, welcome to the ring.
Thank you for having me, mate. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for coming in. And just to kind of frame for anyone who might be listening and, doesn't know you or doesn't know who I am. We're obviously friends from Durham Uni. And I think, it's interesting that we're kind of having a conversation like this. If you were to ask us sort of back, 4 or 5 years ago when we were trying to live it up at uni, Jamie was in the rugby sort of setup, which is kind of known for its quite, I don't know, maybe you can describe the some of the stereotypical sort of traits of the rugby club a bit better than me, but it's known for its kind of very laddie culture and very kind of stereotypically masculine approach. And I think it'd be fair to say that we've sort of both been on a bit of a journey, maybe since then or after then, that sort of just questions that kind of need to just fit into what sort of archetypically seen as like what you should be like as a male, and what's, what you should be like to be popular, and what you should be like to, be successful, and all those kinds of things. And we've just kind of questioned that a little bit, both of us. And we've kind of come to our own, maybe more a slightly deeper understanding on what we, think of as masculinity. So yeah, I don't know if you'd want to sort of add to that at all, Jamie, and maybe touch on some of those things we went through at uni and how you kind of saw it.
Yeah, it's I think the rugby club's probably an interesting place to start. I was chatting to someone the other day about this, and I described it as the perfect cross-section of traditional masculinity, which makes it sound really academic and in depth. But essentially all I mean by that is the traditional stereotypes of being a bloke and masculinity in society has good and bad ends of the spectrum. And you describe like the lad culture and some of maybe the things that people would describe maybe as more like toxic masculinity traditionally, and those things definitely come out in some of the group dynamics at university and within a rugby club where there's alcohol involved as well. But at the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of good and things like courage, camaraderie, teamwork, bravery that typically, and we could probably dive into whether this is good or bad, but typically get associated with masculinity. You get those as well. So I think I'm not playing rugby anymore. I probably hung up the boots about 2 years ago, but I have a complex relationship with rugby and its place in my life, because I've got so many good friends that I'm still, extremely close with today that I met through playing rugby. But I do think there are elements of the sport at all levels, probably all the way up to international, that need looking at from that perspective of some of those more toxic elements of masculinity. So I think that's probably, it's a really interesting one to start with. And I think universities in general it's an interesting place for people. It's your sort of first foray into sort of true in inverted commas independence, and so you're finding yourself in a new way, and that can go a number of ways for people. So yeah, it's
I'm
definitely
interested to hear, like, just can you try and describe how you were that fresher coming to Durham, you were a good rugby player. Can you try and sort of describe as best as you can kind of the mindset that you were in at that point? Because I
yeah.
can kind of remember mine, but it is funny to think back to like that period and like what you think you need to be like. And can you just try and summarize like that feeling, and before you kind of
Yeah.
know about masculinity and all this kind of stuff, just try and put it into words to sort of frame, what it's like.
Yeah, it was so being in the rugby club, I was up there 3 weeks early for pre-season. So um, I was up as a fresher 3 weeks before term started, 4 weeks maybe even. And so moving into, and I was living with one of the second years who I knew, I was living with Stouty
Okay.
in pre-season, and because we were at school together. And so I'd been living sort of this university lifestyle in a house, training 3 times a day for 4 weeks before term even started as a fresher, and then moved into college and sort of started that true or sort of more authentic fresher experience. And it was weird. It was weird adjusting for sure. And I remember definitely feeling a sense that I kind of knew what was going on, and maybe a little bit of not smugness but sort of overconfidence associated with that, because I was like, oh, I've been here for weeks, like and so definitely
I'm
a
tearing it.
little element of that. Yeah. But on the other side of it, I've always been naturally, or especially at that time, naturally more introverted. Was dealing with a bit, especially around that sort of time, 18, 19, 20, a bit of social anxiety. And so I was actually quite shy. And so going into that cauldron that is Freshers Week, and only like not knowing anyone else in the college, and being the only person in my college doing rugby pre-season, I came in and I was sort of this rugby boy wearing his stash around, but also being quite distant and quite aloof and quite shy, which to everyone else, I'm pretty sure, and I've actually spoken to some of my now good friends about what they thought of me in Freshers Week, it just came across as arrogant. And so this, I think there was an element of like, I sort of felt like I knew my way around, but I think the overriding thing was I was feeling pretty exposed, pretty shy, a bit lost, and that came across to other people as arrogant, because I did have some of those stereotypes of being a rugby boy attached to me before I'd even had a chance to speak, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, quite an interesting one for sure.
Yeah. I think that first few weeks at uni is something that a lot of people can relate to, where you're sort of overwhelmed with these feelings of like wanting to fit in and wanting to sort of, be popular as possible, basically. Like the last thing you do is kind of want to stick out or be different in any way. So I think that for me was like the overriding one. But so I say that this is quite relatable for, a lot of people who start uni. But then again, I do think there are some kind of weirdly specific and unique sort of weird things at Durham. One being this kind of rugby, or at least at the time, this kind of rugby culture, where it seemed as though anyone who was sort of part of the rugby club and sort of higher up in the rugby club that you went, it sort of made you like a slightly more important man about town that had sort of some rights that just naturally came off the back of that. And this like is a really interesting concept, because I don't know whether you can just like, can you add to that a little bit in terms of like, how did you notice that being sort of affiliated with like the first team of the rugby club from such an early age, like did you feel that gave you sort of kudos that you maybe didn't feel like you respected? And like why is that as well? Like what
Yeah,
is
it's an interesting one. I think I actually and it's the first time I've thought about it like this, so it's quite quite a good time. But I definitely, well, I'm pretty sure I noticed it from the perspective of, as you said, like a little bit of that air of invincibility or extra protection or extra rights, as you said, like when it comes to, and I think you're right, Durham is a unique bubble in that, yeah, because to take nights out as an example, like there's only so many places that you're going on a night out, and most nights out there was one main place that people would go. I'm really selling it to people, and
Don't
you know,
go.
as simple as, queue jump, like something as simple as that you would just come to expect if you were rugby or first team rugby or whatever it might be. And I think from the outside looking in, that probably looked great, but there were definitely times within that where, I think first year more so than any, where I felt good about that, but also when it was just the rugby crowd, like I felt a little bit at times slightly like an outsider because I didn't quite fit the box, if that makes sense, and I wasn't maybe as outspoken and confident as other people. And rugby is full of big characters, and definitely at that time that wasn't an environment that I thrived in. I sort of probably got by on the fact that I was good at the sport rather than that I was particularly like fit that mold. So yeah, I think there was definitely a feeling, like, don't get me wrong, like there were elements of it that I absolutely loved and that you make the most of when you are, you make the most of the good stuff because it's there, and you don't complain about that stuff when it's getting handed to you, like getting walked into a club and getting free drinks or whatever it might be, all of that stupid stuff. But there were definitely parts on the other side where I was ticking that box and fitting that mold enough, but not quite enough to be completely accepted. And maybe that's just my own actual internal experience of it, and maybe that wasn't what the others felt, but that's how I kind of processed it. And I do think there's a real element in all circumstances where if you feel a bit isolated and a bit detached from a group, that's how you'll end up, because you're giving out that vibe and you're giving out that energy, where because you feel detached, you pull away a bit, and because you're pulling away a bit, people push you away a bit, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. So yeah, I mean, I find the whole conversation about rugby, and especially uni rugby, really interesting, because it seems like a very long time ago, and it seems like quite a different part of my life.
Yeah, it is a really interesting one. Like, do you feel like you could have, say, do you feel like there were certain things that you had to subscribe to in order to play in the, be a good part of the team in the rugby club? Or do you think you actually probably could have been just completely yourself and people would have been absolutely fine with that if you'd had the strength to do it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, the eternal question, I think. And I think the answer is, if you are secure enough in who you are authentically, then it doesn't actually matter whether people like you or not. You don't care if people like you or not. And so, and I also
they'd
think,
actually respect it, to be honest.
I was going to say, yeah, people really respect you for being authentically true to yourself and not caring and not altering who you are in order to fit that box. So I think that, hindsight is a great thing, and would have loved to have known that at the time. But I also think I was probably quite unsure of who I was as well, and still figuring that out. And as a result, I think there were probably parts that I subscribed to because I wanted to subscribe to it, and there are other parts that I subscribed to because that's what you had to do or felt like you had to do in order to get by. I guess I know I'm not hosting. Can I throw something back at you?
Yeah, mate. Feel free. Feel free.
I guess being like, I know the typical stereotypes of how people view rugby boys and rugby clubs.
Yeah.
For you, as someone who had mates in the rugby club but wasn't a part of it, what was your experience of the rugby club at uni?
I think, it's interesting because I think the rugby club as well, from an outside perspective, was also this kind of walking stereotype where everyone jumped to the conclusion straight away as soon as they saw the purple jacket of the rugby club. They were like, oh, it must be like X, must be this, must be that. And we were boxing like the rugby club in as well. So like, you know, as this, all these things that we had, you know, prejudgments in our head that all rugby boys were going to be like, or, you know, I was obviously, I had mates who were within it, and I knew them on a more like individual level and stuff. And like, I mean, I always enjoyed like having just like, you know, conversations behind closed doors with people like you, and you just get to know the real person. And then, so you can then look a little bit beyond that and just, you know, see that it's all individuals. But I wanted to just go back to your point about, what was it? Yeah, it's like that. There can be this real feeling of like pointing the finger at the culture and like the social sex of like, oh my God, like these guys are evil, and they're like peddling this like toxic masculinity culture and stuff. And I think that's not really the root of it. It looks like that's the root of the problem, but I don't think it. I think what you said about how it's actually the only reason it's being upheld is because everyone's just like going along with it, saying that it's fine. And I think when you do get someone who's, you know, maybe confident enough to just be like, look, I'm sorry, that's not for me, but I still want to play rugby and do all the things, but like that thing's not for me. That, you know, the ultimate question is, can you do that? And does it come down to the individual being strong enough to be like, no, that's not a culture that I want to be a part of, and that's the way it changes. Yeah. So it's like,
yeah,
it's a really difficult one. I think it's something I know a lot of people like in those kind of cultures like do feel it's like a really weird balancing point, because like the culture's there for a reason. It's what makes it so good. It's what makes it so like fun at times. Like, I mean, I haven't played as much in rugby cultures, but I've played in cricket clubs, and I know it's maybe not as intense sometimes, like in terms of a culture thing, but it's very similar in terms of, you know, there's like it's a laddie culture. Like you don't have women in the changing rooms, and there's just certain attitudes and kind of there's attitudes that you hear like whilst you're in the dressing room that you sort of that are played off as banter, which, you know, like aren't necessarily like progressive with society and how you really should be, like, you know, day to day. But yeah, it's an interesting one, because it's that battle between like, is there someone to blame, or at the end of the day, does it just come down to you having the strength to just be like, look, I agree with that, but not with other things. And I think from my experience, change only comes about when someone does go like, actually, no, I don't know if I agree with this. And they do have that kind of inner strength to be like, I'm not sure if that fits with my values. So I love the game of rugby, but I don't want to, you know, down a pint of sick, or whatever it may be. And, you know, like if you, so it's a tricky one. And I think we've all at times sort of like done things that, you know, aren't in line with our values, to fit in with the culture. And like, it was really interesting. I had, Bancroft, the cricketer on the podcast. And I think he's kind of the ultimate sort of, example of that. Kind of what we're talking about is that he said that his overriding feelings just, I just want to fit in. I want to be a part of this team. Like, these guys are my mates. Like, I want to be popular. That's like the biggest thing that drives you especially when you're new to like uni, and you're literally so overwhelmed with like all of those pressures. Like, you're not thinking at that time, like, oh, I want to be really true to my values and like be a good person. Like, let's be honest, you just don't really care about that sort of stuff. And that's why, like, you just go along with whatever the culture is at that time. And, you know, that led to him, you know, like cheating in a game and rubbing on the crew. It doesn't make him like a bad person. It's just he was valuing that fitting in more than, you know, being true to himself at the time. But yeah, I guess that's like the ultimate question, is like that being true to yourself, like versus, you know, fitting in with whatever cultures, and even if, you know, maybe they're not particularly like moral cultures at that time. But yeah, to just kind of move the conversation on, I guess transitioning into kind of, you know, after uni, and when did kind of these more, let's call them like kind of mental health and kind of becoming a little bit more aware of your own emotions, like did it hit kind of a crisis point that made you realize? Was it during uni? Was it coming out of uni? Could you just go into a little bit more around kind of your mental health journey, and then when you started to become a bit more aware of these kind of things?
Yeah, for sure. So, I guess, again, coming back to hindsight, like looking way back, my mental health journey, even though I didn't know it at the time, probably started when I was 15, when my parents got divorced. And that for me is definitely like a single trigger point that fed into a lot of things that progressed over the next, you know, ultimately the next 10 years. So for me, it was probably the ages of like 15 to 21 or getting into uni, that I wasn't really familiar with mental health as a topic or even as a subject, let alone have any consideration of my own mental health. Like it just wasn't on my radar. I was going through a really tough time. I was experiencing really serious bouts of anxiety and depression, but I just ultimately I just felt shit. Like
Yeah.
that was my understanding of it. It was just, this is how I feel, which was actually really difficult, because if you don't have a name for something, or if you don't have an understanding or an awareness of something, you just accept that that is what you are or who you are. So that kind of progressed in the anxiety, and kind of anxiety specifically relating to abandonment. And that for me sort of stemmed from my parents' divorce, but reared its head most prominently in romantic relationships, so in dating. And you know, I think understandably, as I was getting older, as I was getting to uni, relationships got more serious, more, you know, interesting, like they just mattered more, or so I thought. And so that anxiety got worse, and it just sort of fed into a point where the anxiety that I was experiencing from these relationships was then sort of not as acute as it was. It wasn't just specific anymore. It sort of became a low hum that then turned into a more like deep rooted issue and depression. And then in second year at uni, I was dating someone, and her dad was a psychologist, and or psychotherapist, I think, actually. And that for me was the first point at which I even had an understanding or a conversation about mental health. And initially not even about my own mental health, like we were just talking about it. And then I think I've just had one point where I was really, really struggling with this anxiety relating to our relationship, and sort of broke down. And she said, you know, have you thought about talking to someone? And I was like, no, obviously not. Like, this is just me.
Why
This
would
is
I do
just
that?
this is just me getting anxious about our relationship. She's like, but nothing's happened. Like, it's 3 p.m. on a Sunday, and we're in my room, and you're just sobbing. And I was just like,
Oh yeah, maybe that isn't normal.
maybe that's not normal. And, you know, so then from there, I decided that I'd try and see one of the university counselors, which unfortunately didn't work out for me. Like, I went and saw someone a couple of times, but either the service wasn't quite what I needed, or I wasn't quite ready to hear what they had to say or to help myself. And so sort of just went on with my life, and that relationship ended. And I just sort of carried on with uni, carried on with life. And then it was end of 2018, so about 2 years ago now, I had just got into a new relationship, and this anxiety was worse than it had ever been before. And it was about a year prior to that I was dating someone else, and I started having panic attacks as a result of the abandonment anxiety. And again, these panic attacks started happening, started becoming more and more frequent. and got to the point where they're pretty much daily. And it was just really impacting not only the relationship, but also my day-to-day life, my work. We were working together, so I was having panic attacks at work, and it was just really taking over. And that, for me, you know, to come back to the question in a bit of a roundabout way, was like the trigger point, because it was just too much. Like it'd been too much for a while, but that was the point at which I was like, this is not okay. Again, it was sort of not a solo realization. It was other people sort of also realizing that something was off.
And this was 2018, did you say?
Yeah, September.
So you battled with it for quite a long time, sort of.
Yeah, essentially 10 years. So, and I think over that 10 years, getting gradually worse and worse and worse as well, which I think, you know, obviously in hindsight, again, didn't help the matter.
Yeah.
And then got to that sort of, I guess, almost breaking point, and would love to say I sort of helped myself, but it was very much my mum's doing. And she sort of said, look, we've tried therapy before. Do you want me to go and find someone for you that, you know, someone new? Because everyone, like, I'd seen a few therapists before and hadn't really had much luck. And so, yeah, I was like, yeah, why not? Like, what's the worst that could happen? Met this therapist for the first time, started working together, and it just sort of seemed to click. And that for me was sort of the first time where I started seeing some, I suppose, some sense to this. And this is why I think with mental health, it's really important to remember that whatever you're experiencing, there is a reason. And it's not a, you know, we said like that, my response, me sobbing on that Sunday afternoon at uni, wasn't normal, but because of what had happened and how it had progressed, and that was the normal response to the last 8 years of what I'd been going through. And so to actually get an understanding of where it might have come from, how it had come about, what it was, and how I might go about treating it, was really powerful to actually, as a first step, just be like, okay, this isn't just how things are. There is a way out. This is really what I can do. And, you know, as quite an analytical, like, left brain person, it was really helpful for me to be able to put a name to something, but also be able to see like how I could work through this. So that was sort of, how I got to that point. And then appreciate I'm rambling, but I'm almost there.
No, it's all good. It's all good stuff. I've been just making like a massive list of things that I want to ask you about, but keep going.
Yeah, I'm almost there. So this was sort of early 2019, like January, February, March 2019, making really good progress. And then was sort of making progress, but not getting through it. And so my therapist suggested antidepressants, and that for me had always been something I've been really resistant to. I think when I was 17, I got prescribed antidepressants without actually having a particularly lengthy conversation with a GP. Like, literally just got handed a prescription, and that to me, I never took them at the time. And I'd always been quite anti-medication for mental health for a number of reasons. But the way in which my therapist described it to me for anxiety, she said essentially what an antidepressant can do when you're going through serious anxiety is essentially get your head above water so that you can see the triggers, you can see what's going on before it gets to a panic attack. Because essentially for me, it was like, there's this trigger, and before I know it, I'm having a panic attack, but there's actually a whole load of thoughts and feelings that go on in between those points. And so the antidepressants combined with the therapy, which is a really important factor, like the combination of the two, allowed me to create a bit of headspace to start to process what was going on. So that was sort of where I really started making progress. And then, as you mentioned in the intro, really tragically lost a friend from school to suicide last May. So I guess kind of right in the thick of, 5 months, 6 months of hard work on myself. And that was, again, a bit of a turning point for me in terms of having that kind of conversation, because obviously I'd spent the last few months talking to my mum and my therapist and getting comfortable with actually owning what I was going through, but I'd never even considered talking about this stuff to, let alone publicly, just to my mates. And it George dying that really, in a way, just sort of forced vulnerability onto me, because in that moment we're all sat around crying and talking about what had happened. It wasn't scary anymore to have that conversation because we'd all been through something horrible together, and I didn't want anyone else in that circle to feel like they couldn't have the same conversation with me. So that really was the start of those conversations, and then it's just gone from there to where we are today.
Awesome. Yeah, well put. You kind of nicely given an overview of the whole journey there. I've literally got so many questions that we can dive into, but so I guess where I wanted to start was what I picked up on was just like how you talk about it almost looking as this quite simple, like obvious thing of like, a lot of the time men don't let ourselves ask the question of like, could this be better? Like that's something that I noticed is I was so willing to just like, or I'm still willing with a lot of things, just to like put up with things and just get on with things, like, and just accept them for the way they are. And any kind of like admission of it's not as good as it could be is like a sign of weakness, but actually that admission of it's not as good as it could be is the kind of the starting point to improving. And I guess that hits on this like sort of at all costs, like wanting to like men have this tendency to want to show that we're fine the whole time. So yeah, I don't know, have you thought about that in any more depth? Like I guess I don't know if I've got any like sort of super deep sort of thoughts around that and like why that is, but I know that it's definitely a thing in our society, is that kind of traditionally, I know that it's especially maybe like if you look at like an older generation, men aren't necessarily known as being kind of open and emotional, and that being like a really like sort of definition of masculinity. But that's something that I definitely put up with for a long time. Like I wasn't willing to admit that certain things weren't perfect. And it was only when I did start to admit that certain things weren't perfect that I could actually start working on them. But what did you think?
There's a lot of stuff that came up when you were chatting there. I think it's something I speak about quite often, just around this concept of emotional repression and suppression that has become very normalized for men. It's almost, one of the overriding characteristics of a traditional man is, you might call it something else. You might call it resilience or stoicism, but what it actually is just emotional repression that's become so normalized by society that we don't really give it too much thought. It's just this, there's this quote that basically says, when we say that someone is acting like a girl, what we're actually saying is that they are outwardly expressing their internal emotional experience. But when we're saying to someone, you need to act like a man, we're telling them to internalize their emotional experience. And that is just what we've accepted for a very long time. So there's a huge amount to be done on why that is. And I think attached to those traditional masculine stereotypes are things like you said around, I guess, always being not necessarily perfect, but like things always being okay. Like no matter what's going on, you are the one to hold the strength. You are the one to provide. You are the one to care for. And while it might seem, I think it's a short-term versus long-term thing. I think when we think short-term, that might be a good way to protect other people from what's going on around them. But longer term, it's just super detrimental, because not only do you take on a huge amount of burden yourself, but you're also teaching other people, whether that's your kids or otherwise, that the way to deal with things is to ignore them or push them down, rather than, what is now for a lot of people deemed as the healthy way to process emotions, which is actually expressing them as you feel them, rather than trying to quash them and ignore them, because it always comes back to bite you.
Yeah. Well, so that was the big, like, for me, that was a big turning point in my, and I want to go on to talk about like mental health as just as a term, because it's quite it carries a stigma in itself. I think, like, it's a lot of times when people say mental health, they immediately think sort of an illness that only some people have and that other people don't have. But just before we go into that, what I wanted to say was that kind of that expressing emotion as they are, like, that was the one single biggest turning point for me in terms of my mental health. Like, I'd say my mental health journey was kind of unextraordinary and wasn't like, I'd say fortunately was never been like, got to a point where it's like really, existentially bad or anything like that. But what I do know is that I quite sensitive, and like, I'm quite, like, I knew that there was things that I would project that in a different way to how I actually felt inside. And that would get me like that I would get to a point where I'd have like a couple of days, per month, where I'd just be feeling like pretty anxious, pretty like unconfident, really feel like I'd be like putting a mask onto the world. And the biggest turning point for me was that I, for up till 20, I guess it was about 22, 23 years, like I would never really have an outlet at all that I could just tell the truth to, just tell like the exact, honest sort of what's going on in my head too. And it was only when I started doing it, and it's quite hard I found it really hard to find people that I could sort of tell those things that I felt really uncomfortable talking about to initially. Like, it felt really kind of alien, and it felt like I was being, like, by my old definition, such a girl, like sort of coming out with all these like real emotions. But I actually ended up, I saw like a one-to-one, like just in a private space, just it was kind of a few things that happened around my career that sort of triggered it. But that for me was a big turning point when I started having a sounding board that I could just express a little bit more truth to. I think that makes a massive difference. So just because when you talk about mental health, it's like, how can you hammer down on like actual practical things that make a difference to your mental health, if that makes sense. But I don't know if you found that, or anything else in particular that's like kind of really helped you on a practical level.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I just had a thought as well to kind of loop back to what we were saying about that authenticity within a rugby club, was the example we were talking about.
Yeah.
And it's very similar to having vulnerable conversations with people. Like, ultimately, both is terrifying to stand up in that kind of environment and be truly yourself when it means telling someone no, or or saying you don't want to do something. That puts you in a vulnerable position, and it takes vulnerability to be fully authentic, because then you are leaving yourself exposed to be rejected or accepted, and you have to deal with that rather than just trying to fit a box and hope that everyone will, not realize that you've got that on. So I think it's 100%. Really, really interesting, like the link between vulnerability and authenticity. But in terms of what helped me get to that point, I think I said that moment with my friends after George died, that for me was the moment, and I wouldn't want other people to have to go through that kind of moment to gain that perspective and gain that comfort, sort of that vulnerability. But the other thing is that vulnerability, while it's scary, is also like hyper contagious. It's as soon as, like, you often find it takes a lot of balls, and interesting concept saying a lot of balls, but it takes a lot of balls to be the first person to say that, and to be the first person to open up about your struggles, or because you're exposing yourself and you don't know how people are going to respond. But
yeah,
in more often than not, I'd say even sort of very often, as soon as one person does, someone else will, and then someone else will, and it's like this sort of domino effect.
yeah.
People are like, okay, oh God, I'm so glad you said
Yeah.
that, because I've been waiting months to say that, and I've always hated that thing about the rugby club, and I'm so glad that you said that. And like little things like that, that
Yeah.
we've all spent so long putting up walls and putting on masks and not quite being true to who we are, that when it comes to doing it, it's difficult, but once you do it, it's a massive relief as well. Like, it's such a weight off.
Massively.
And the more you can do it, the better.
It's like a muscle, isn't it? Almost. It's like once you sort of start building it up and you can sort of start off by being authentic just in private, one-on-one with someone who's not going to judge you. And then you start to build up that muscle slowly, because in the society that we've grown up in, it's probably like, you know, atrophied, like, because I would say that being authentic, like really like deeply authentic and telling exactly what's, you know, on your mind is quite rare, because a lot of the time you're going to upset someone by saying exactly what you think. So yeah, it is like this muscle. And going back to your point, I've had like even friendships where, you know, we've had like a good friendship, but it's been maybe like, well, it's been at a level, and then one person will just sort of very like loosely like slip in something that's just a little bit more vulnerable and like authentic, and then the other person sort of jumps on it, and it takes the relationship to like a whole new level, because you sort of peel back another like layer of the onion. So
yeah, and
it's cool.
It's amazing how quickly that happens as well. Like the deepening of the relationship off of what, you know, one vulnerable conversation is pretty incredible. And as well, it's really interesting. And I don't 100% know why this is. I think it's probably because you feel more at risk of being exposed, but people, myself included, find it much easier to share their vulnerabilities with strangers in the first instance.
Yeah, for
so
sure.
whether that's a stranger at a festival when you're both drunk out of your minds and you're telling them your problems, or, you know, my girl mates always give examples like the girls' toilets in a nightclub, like sharing every problem they've ever had. And like therapists are the obvious example. Like, they are a stranger.
Don't do it in the boys' toilets.
I think we should, mate. I think we've got to start encouraging that. Because
you do occasionally hear it.
Yeah. So yeah, people have this thing where they're so much more comfortable telling a stranger about their problems than your friends. And that seems counterintuitive, because your friends are people that you care about and that you should trust. But we've all spent so long trying to be something, trying to be a number of things, that you worry if you say, actually, you know, stuff isn't great, or I can't do that, then you're going to be outcast or exposed. So I think that's where the fear and the stigma comes from. But it's something that can be changed. It just takes practice, as you said. It takes training that muscle, and it does take courage. Like, vulnerability takes strength and it takes courage. I think that's another thing that we need to work around, is like, vulnerability still comes with connotations of weakness, when a lot of the time when you choose to be vulnerable, like, it's one of the biggest strengths that you can have. So it's not easy. Like, I don't want to trivialize it, but it's powerful for sure. I
was going to add something there, but I feel like it's kind of, we've got to wrap it up. But I completely agree with you on the point of, like, it's 100% easier to share with a stranger first, like when you're just starting to build that muscle up, because it comes back to that fear of judgment, which is not to be trivialized. Like, people are like, oh, why do you care what people think? Like, but everyone cares how you're being perceived. Like, if you don't care about that, then like, everyone cares to an extent, like how they want to be perceived as a good person and you know, liked and things like that. So I can really, like, I've heard a lot in the past, like, oh, what can't you know, speak to your friends about your you know, major problems? But actually, like, a lot of the time, especially like at uni, in that your friends are often the people that you had fun with. But it's a whole different level when you can like properly confide in someone and tell them like, yeah, you know, what's really going on. But, you know, I always think about like, I think people are different as well. Like, I think you and I are probably on the more like sensitive end of the spectrum, where we think about these things probably more than a lot of other people. Like, I have found that, like, and I think that just comes down to, you've got to know where you lie, and you've got to know yourself. Like, some people have this, like, I for one I know as soon as I start, you know, sort of telling lies or trying to be someone I'm not, that is just catastrophic. Like, I just go off the rails. So I have to keep up that kind of, you know, having an outlet for being honest. Whereas I think some people don't have that as much. Like, maybe they should more or less, I don't know, but I think people value different things, and, you know, not everyone's the same. So it can be a temptation to kind of impose my way of seeing the world like on other people, and think that like, this is how you know, have the best mental health. But maybe that's not the way as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to, it's a really important point actually, because everyone's experience of mental health and everyone's experience of their own minds are completely different. I think there are things that you can encourage, and I think there are things that, you know, we all learn about this stuff really from personal experience. So you can only speak from what's helped you, and you can only speak from what you think is the right thing to do. And I'm yet to see someone who's been, you know, hurt or hampered by being more authentic and more vulnerable. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, there's not a one size fits all, but I think there are things that are, you know, encouraged rather than, you know, things that might, yeah.
And just on that point, I wanted to make a note of something. I actually wanted to bring this up way earlier, like in the conversation, but
of course.
And I mentioned it before, but it was like this, like when you bring up mental health, like male mental health, you know, it's can be quickly kind of thought of as something that's like an illness that like some people get diagnosed with all of a sudden. But I kind of like seeing mental health more like physical health, where it's something that you know, have to work on. Everyone has it. Everyone's on a scale of it to some extent. You know, like physical health, I think some people are more prone to bad physical health, or they're more prone to bad mental health. So if you could maybe just like kind of unbox the term, you know, mental health, and what it actually now means to you, now that you kind of understand it better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right. I think there's still stigma attached to the term mental health, because it does get associated with old, sort of more traditional notions of mental illness. And I think there's been a load of good work done to make mental health more a case of how healthy is your mind. And I think that's why you see more, I guess, slight changes in the terminology, like mental fitness or mental well-being or whatever it might be. And that is the old, or not so old, last couple of years, people talking about just this quote, like, we all have mental health. And I think that's probably the first place to start. And interesting that you kind of use the analogy of the scale, because that's something that I always talk about. I talk about this like spectrum of mental health that we all sit on, and we, based on our upbringing, our past traumas, our life events, we tend towards a point on that scale naturally, and that could be nearer to the bottom, it could be nearer to the top, and so based on that, you can trend more one way than the other. And so working on it and realizing that it's constant, like it's in constant flux. And that's why, I was saying to you, like yesterday, I had one of the worst mental health days I've had in a very, very long time, to the point that I went to bed and I was like, I'm genuinely worried about my mental health, and woke up today feeling completely fine. Because I'd actually done some stuff yesterday that I know helps me, right. But I had gotten myself into a place a little bit where I was waiting until I felt good to do the stuff that helps me, rather than doing the stuff and then feeling good afterwards. So yeah, you can obviously trend up and down on that scale. And I think that actually thinking about it like that really helped me, because, for example, I think it was September last year, and I'd done, 9 months to a year of really good work on mental health, and was still seeing my therapist, and essentially thought I was cured, whatever the hell that means.
Yeah.
And then I had a really, really, a day like yesterday, a really, really bad couple of days, and the world fell around me because I thought I was back to square one. But that, I think, is why this idea of the scale is important,
Yeah.
because it's not a case of being
You
done
don't
with the
get cured
work.
and done.
You don't get cured. You
No.
figure out what works for you, and
Yeah.
you also appreciate that you have good days and you have bad days.
Mm.
And there's a bit of a misnomer in mental health at the moment, that some people are propagating, which is that the goal of this work is to feel good all of the time, which is just not possible and not achievable. And so it actually means that when people don't feel good, they think that they're doing something wrong, which then makes them feel worse. So we can't have this sort of toxic positivity
Sure.
about you have to always feel good, otherwise your mental health is no good.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So I think that's an important one with that spectrum. And also, to come back to something I mentioned earlier with my own journey with this, is that what we quite often deem as mental health issues, an isolated depression, like you have been diagnosed with depression, and what seems like this sort of over medicalized chemical imbalance in the brain of serotonin, or however people want to pitch it to you, is actually more often than not a culmination of your body and your mind's natural response to things that have happened in your life. So it's not just a case of one day you became depressed. It's over the course of your life, these things have happened. You might not have processed them in the right way. You might not have had the outlet to talk about them. And as a result, over time, you've slid down that scale and you've fallen into a cycle of depression.
Yeah.
So I think there's been some really important things for me, but that scale, I think, is a really important thing to remember, just from that perspective of not ever feeling like this stuff goes away.
Yeah.
But also learning throughout that whole experience how to manage it and how to manage my own mental health.
Yeah, exactly. Just like kind of going to the gym to keep in good shape, sort of, you have to, build up and yeah, I wanted it to kind of go into this more to sort of finish off the conversation, because I think when you talk about this sort of mental health and vulnerability and stuff, it's quite easy to stay high level, but to actually get to kind of the more practical, like, okay, but so I wanted to actually go back to what you were talking about in it around the kind of relationships and like abandonment, if you don't mind, and just like kind of
For sure.
talk a little bit more about like, why, and like how does that show up? Like, I know, yeah, like relationships, you can, learn a hell of a lot, especially like the early ones when you don't really know yourself too well. But yeah, can you, if you don't mind, just kind of speak a little bit more about like, where that maybe came from? Like what did it feel like to have that feeling of like abandonment? And then how did you actually practically get over that? And then what are some of those things that you now like instill day to day to keep that in
Yeah,
check?
for sure. So in terms of how and why, so I think for me, ultimately, it kind of stems back to, again, my parents' divorce, and because it was quite sudden and quite, it was a big shock, essentially, that it kind of came out of nowhere. And I think when you're young, we have this sort of notion of our parents as infallible and perfect, and
Yeah.
they can do no wrong. Like, they are the two most trusted people in your life. And so when something like that happens, it feels like they've broken your trust, and it feels like they have wronged you, when in hindsight they have done what they, as individuals, when you start thinking about your parents as humans and people rather than parents, they did what they needed to do for themselves. And that's why I would never ever cast any blame their way for this stuff. And I'm always kind of always make sure to make that clear. But obviously as a child, not really knowing how to process that, and being in sort of those formative teenage years, it felt like I, couldn't trust people, and that people would, people I care about strongly would leave. Like, that was the pattern in my head that would happen. So if I think about sort of later on towards uni, it would just be like really intense, unjustified jealousy and worrying about what they were doing, where they were at all times, and not actually being able to deal with any level of uncertainty within a relationship. And early on in a relationship especially, there is always uncertainty. Like, you don't know where you stand, and I just had a torrid time dealing with any kind of uncertainty, which then, as I got towards sort of 24, 25, I had quite a kind of only a couple of months dating someone, but it was particularly toxic. And that's when the panic attack started. So it went from me being really worried about what was going on to then physical symptoms as well. So like, feel like my skin was buzzing, my heart was racing, my breathing was, going overdrive. I couldn't sleep, all kinds of sort of physical symptoms. And, just getting really, really upset, really emotional within that kind of thing. And with panic attacks as well, for me, feeling very dissociated, like completely detached from the situation around me. Like, I was so in my own head that, it was just completely overwhelming. And so that's really how it came up. And then obviously being early on in a relationship and that happening, that's really intense for the other person. I mean, it's intense for me, but it's equally, if not more intense for the other person. And so obviously, I think obviously is a fair word. Obviously that's not good, and they run the other way. And then I've actually fulfilled the prophecy of the thing I was worried about in the first place. Like, I've created that myself by that anxiety. So it's not, it's not a great pattern, but so it was really, it was intense.
It's tough. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the reason I kind of wanted to ask you about that is because, as we said, like, people, have a complete scale of how they react to it. But I admire the fact that you've, brought up admitting to the fact that you even feel like jealous, for example. Like, I know that is a very hard thing to admit as a man that you've ever felt, in a relationship, for example. So it's just, I just wanted to kind of just because I'm sure people can relate in all different ways that they've experienced. Like, I think that is important, but yeah, carry on with kind of how that played out and what you did.
Yeah, for sure. I think as well, like, there was a big issue of just sort of security within myself as well. So actually feeling if this person left, that things wouldn't be okay if I was on my own, even though I'd been on my own a number of times and been completely fine. So that's how that played out. And then once I started working through it and working on it, like, the big thing, as I said, for me, was that combination of therapy and antidepressants, just to get a handle on what the triggers actually were. And then with my therapist, did a lot of CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, which is essentially reframing thoughts, reframing triggers, rewiring behavior patterns in terms of that's your trigger, and sort of just hammering home the fact that my girlfriend talking to another guy doesn't, like, I jumped straight from that to her leaving me, and there's so many things that have to go on in between those two for that to ever become an eventuality. But in my mind, it just jumped from A to B. So it was, that really, really helped. And then I think from a more practical perspective, these things don't, as we've discussed, like, they don't necessarily go away. And I've definitely, I think last year especially, trying to date, and while I was doing this work, was kind of interesting to see what my response would be and see how I would react to some of those situations. And so from there, it became more about doing the practical things that actually help my mental health day to day. So, you know, it's an old classic, but exercise is a huge thing for me, like hands down. Like it's a cliche piece of advice for a reason. It's because it works. Just really trying where possible to create as much space between a trigger and my next thought or my next feeling. So a big one for me is breath work, and that for me has sort of changed the game in terms of how I manage my physical symptoms of anxiety, and so also manage like the mental and emotional responses. And just being aware of how my body is reacting to a situation is really, really important. So if my heart rate goes up or my breathing rate goes up, then I can actually pick that up, realize that, and then change that through breathing to sort of adjust how I ultimately respond to it from a mental and emotional perspective. So
That's cool.
it's as with all these things, mate, it's the work doesn't stop, and I don't think, you know, I wouldn't claim to be the finished product by any means. And yeah, it's important, I think, for people to understand that for their own journeys as well. It's like, if you think you've worked through something, there may well come a time where it comes up again, maybe not as strongly, but there will still be, you know, some of those subconscious underlying things that pop back up. So yeah, that's something, you know, that self-awareness really helps with, just sort of understanding, you know, where you're at and what certain things trigger within you.
Yeah, I was just gonna, when you were talking about there, like I was wondering whether that you think there's a link to when you were talking about like kind of the fear of loss and kind of that irrational sort of fear of loss. Do you think there's a link? I'm sort of speculating here. I don't know whether this is bang on or not, but do you think there's a link there to that thing that we were talking about with kind of authenticity and just kind of being in a state where you kind of want to sort of fit in and you don't really know yourself as well? Like I'm kind of trying to just sync them up with my own experiences, not that they'll be similar, or I have no idea, but like I've sometimes found that when you're in a place where you're kind of being true to yourself and you're kind of being authentic, like you're probably in a space where you're not going to be like as jealous or like scared of loss, because at the end of the day, like if you're being sort of more yourself, like it's kind of you've got like a more solid foundation, if that makes sense. I don't know if that trivializes kind of your situation or like whether that was different, but I don't know if there is a link there or not.
I think for sure. I think it's all linked. And as you said, I think if you are fully comfortable in your identity and your authenticity and who you are, then if someone doesn't want to be with you, then why would you want to be with them? Like that's the kind of crux of the matter. And again, that sort of simplifies it a little bit, because there are emotions involved and, you know, history and whatever else. And, you know, it could be a year, 2-3 years of a relationship that you don't want to let go of. And so you can't just be like, oh, well, if they don't want to be with me, I don't want to be with them. It's not quite that simple. But
no, I know what you mean.
Yeah, I think as well, it ties in, like I've been doing quite a lot of reading about codependency, and that's a term that gets banded around quite a lot, specifically to romantic relationships. But what I've come to understand by codependency is sort of proactively and presumptively changing your behavior or changing what you're doing because of how it might affect someone else. So you are changing who you are, not completely, but sort of being slightly inauthentic in your behavior and not acting true to yourself because you're worried of how it might impact someone else, when really you don't know how that's going to impact someone else. And so that's how I think we tie ourselves in knots, because we're super worried, you know, through this. If I'm trying to make the link to the anxiety that I felt, really worried about losing this person, so I'm going to try and be exactly what I think they want me to be. And lose complete sight of who I am. And I always used to talk about this to my therapist. I said to her, I feel like a different person when I'm single to when I'm in a relationship. And it's because I'm creating this, or trying to be I'm trying to be a good boyfriend, or I'm trying to be the person that they want. That's not me. And so I think that is it's a really nice link in terms of the importance of that authenticity across all spectrums.
Yeah, massively. Well, yeah, I think that that kind of sort of rounds up that round quite nicely, I think, because it just sort of, whenever I talk about these kind of things, it hits me that it's such a complex and subjective thing to talk about. And I think that's why in society it's difficult to get a grip on it, because with physical illness, it's so much easier to just like, point the MRI scanner and like diagnose exactly what it is. But with mental health, it's totally subjective. And then there's like a gray area between mental health and mental illness and mental fitness. And like, we're all in a process of like learning a little bit more, about it. And I think you can only have a good understanding of your own, really, and try and, compare that to others and find some sense in it, which hopefully we've done today.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. But, sorry, mate, I was just going to say, like, it is just so, it's super complex and obviously so highly unique and individual to everyone. So I hope, my hope with all of these conversations across, your pod, my pod, is that there are, bits that people can resonate with and can take away. So hopefully there are some bits in there for people.
Awesome. Well, I've got a few questions for you to finish in the 12th round of the bout. 12th round of the bout. So my first question is, what's something that you think about that your mates would have no idea that you think about?
I was thinking about this one. And the thing that I landed on is that as I've kind of gone through this journey of my own mental health, I've gotten into yoga, and I'm training to be a breathwork teacher, and sort of more, even the word makes me feel a bit weird saying it, but like more spiritual realms, and spiritual, more of my own spirituality. And so that is definitely something that I probably don't speak to my mates enough about, or not at all, really. And it's sort of my spirituality and things like the concept of energy, like simple stuff like that seems to people who might not have any interest in it as, really out there, but to me has become quite an important part of who I am. So I think that's probably the one on record as the one thing that I probably don't chat to many of my mates about. It's just spirituality in general, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's one of my favorite questions, because I think, well, I reckon that everyone has, things that I certainly do. But yeah, energy one is like a good one, because it's like, as soon as you bring it up in like a conversation, it's like, oh my God, that's so woo woo. But then if you actually think about it, it's very scientifically backed in terms of like the, energy, frequency and vibration of the, like, not to get all quantum mechanics on you, but it's not actually like, woo woo stuff. And like, anyway, if you ever want to have a further chat about it, just slide into my WhatsApps. My second question is probably with relation to kind of what we've been talking about, but how do you think society will be different in 10 years time?
Probably two sides to this question. I think how do I hope it will be versus how do I think it will be, and I'd like to think that they're the same. I guess from a mental health perspective, like my big why, my big goal in the work that I'm doing, or the work that I'm starting to do more of, is to change the way we talk about and ultimately treat mental health. So, and we're starting to see it, but I think in 10 years time, I'd like to think that we'll be in a place where big pharma doesn't rule the mental health world. And as a result, it's not purely a medical thing. You're not going to your GP as a 17-year-old boy and telling them that you feel a bit sad and them handing you a prescription for antidepressants. It needs to be a more holistic, integrated approach where we're thinking about not only traditional therapy, but past trauma, life events in general, and looking at how that mind-body link as well, because from my perspective, and a lot of the research that's coming out is looking at trauma and the effect on the body rather than just thinking about how it affects purely the brain. And with that, and this I'm sure could be a whole nother podcast episode, the work that's being done into psychedelics for depression and mental health, I think I'd like to think in 10 years time, hopefully even 5 years time, we'll be at a point where that again is on the agenda rather than being sort of fringe. And that ultimately I think comes down to government and to big pharma and the money that they make from medication and antidepressants at the moment.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there's, as our kind of understanding, like there's so, I now, like, I don't know whether it's just my social media echo chamber, but there seems to be more and more like, you know, stuff being talked about in the realm of like psychedelics and, you know, mental health and all this kind of thing. So yeah, I hope that there's kind of going to be more of an understanding around these things so that we can like better sort of use them as tools. But yeah, that is, you've opened up some big cans of worms, and my instinct is to just pounce and go into them. But I know if I do, then it will be another few. Maybe we can do another one at some point and focus in on one of those kind of things. But really enjoyed chatting. It's been yeah, very, very good fun. And my last question that I ask pretty much everyone who comes in is now, when you leave the ring in unboxing, you have an outro rather than an intro. So if you could pick one song for that to be to drop the mic and play you out, what would that be?
I wanted to pick one that was relevant to, I guess, the work that I'm doing and the conversation that we've just had. And there is I don't even know if it's a full track, but there's a track on Loyal Kana's album called, the album's called Not Waving But Drowning, and the track is called Not Waving But Drowning. And it's based on a poem. And I guess from the title, Not Waving But Drowning, it's basically about this guy who's out at sea and he's like flailing about. Everyone thinks he's really happy and waving, but actually he's flailing about because he's about to drown. And I think that sort of, it's not the cheeriest outro song, but it kind of speaks to what a lot of guys and a lot of people in general are going through in terms of, from the outside, it might look like you're happy and having a great
100%.
time, but you're actually struggling, you're actually drowning. So that for me is probably the one that speaks to the chat we've just had.
Awesome. Yeah, that sums it up really nicely. I'm sure I've listened to it at some point in my listening to him, but yeah, we'll have to get that to play us out. Jamie, thanks a lot for joining me in the ring, and sure I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, mate.
Cheers.